Alistair Thorne stood on the pier, shivering in the cold Atlantic rain. I watched him from the bridge of his own flagship. I wasn't just taking his money. I was erasing his bloodline from the history of this city. They thought Solene Sterling was a ghost, a quiet woman clinging to a dead past. Alistair laughed while he signed the order to bulldoze her family estate. He called her heritage a footnote in his ledger. He didn't realize he was signing the death warrant for his grandfather's empire. Solene adjusted her emerald-dyed Platinum Panther Cuff. The green stones caught the light of the crashing stocks. She didn't want an apology. She wanted the reversionary interest. Alistair spent $500 million building on her soil. He didn't know that under maritime law, every brick he laid, every pier he built, now belonged to her. In the next few minutes, you will see how one forgotten paper from 1842 can bankrupt a billionaire. In 60 seconds, this is not a story of luck. It is a masterclass in institutional execution. Pay attention, because the elite always forget that the ocean never forgets a debt. The rain over the Sterling estate did not fall. It descended. It was a heavy, slate-gray curtain that smelled of salt spray and old iron-rich earth. Solene Sterling stood on the third-floor balcony of her ancestral home. She did not shiver. The cold was an old friend. She was wrapped in a floor-length coat of charcoal cashmere that swallowed the light. Below her, the quiet of the morning was being systematically murdered. The sound arrived first. A low, rhythmic growl of heavy diesel engines that vibrated in the soles of her feet. Then came the yellow. 3 massive industrial bulldozers, painted in a shade of predatory gold that felt like a bruise against the soft greens of her gardens. They sat idling at the edge of the perimeter, waiting. Solene adjusted the emerald-dyed Platinum Panther Cuff on her right wrist. The platinum was cold against her mahogany skin. She ran a thumb over the emerald eyes of the panther. They were the same shade as the moss on the ancient oaks she was about to lose. Her skin possessed a matte finish, flawless. Her cheekbones were sharp enough to cut the very air that Thorne was currently polluting. She looked down at the iron gates. They had stood for 180 years. They were hand-forged by men who understood that a boundary is a sacred thing. A black Maybach pulled up behind the machinery. The door opened. Alistair Thorne stepped out. Even from this height, Solene could see the smug tilt of his head. He was wearing a navy blue overcoat. A silk pocket square, the color of a fresh wound, peeked from his chest. He looked up at the house. He looked at the silver-flecked afro-tapered cut that crowned Solene's head. He didn't see a woman. He saw a line item on a spreadsheet that needed to be deleted. Alistair raised a hand. A casual, dismissive wave. The lead bulldozer surged forward. The sound of the iron gates buckling was not a crash. It was a scream. A high-pitched metallic agony that echoed off the stone face of the mansion. The hinges set deep into the granite pillars, groaned and then failed. The gates were trampled into the mud. The yellow machines didn't stop. They ground the intricate ironwork into the dirt as they rolled onto the gravel path. Solene's pulse did not quicken. She watched the destruction with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a terminal virus. Alistair Thorne began to walk. He stepped over the ruins of the gate with a practiced elegance. He was smiling. He stopped 20 paces from the front door and looked up at Solene. He shouted over the roar of the engines. His voice was thin, brittle. Solene. I told you this day was coming. The city has signed the order. Eminent domain is a beautiful thing when you have the right friends. You have 1 hour to collect your trinkets. After that, this house becomes a memory. Solene did not respond. She did not scream. She did not plead. She simply watched the way the rain matted his expensive hair. She thought about the concept of ownership. Alistair believed ownership was a piece of paper signed by a bribed official. Solene knew that true ownership was written in the marrow of the earth. It was a lineage of blood and silent contracts that preceded his entire family tree. She looked at her panther cuff again. The emerald eyes seemed to glow in the dull light. Alistair mistook her silence for defeat. He turned to the foreman of the crew and gestured toward the east wing, the wing that housed the library, the wing that held the records of the Sterling family since the mid-19th century. Level it first. I want her to watch her history turn into dust. The foreman hesitated. He looked up at Solene. There was something in her posture that made him pause. It was the stillness. A person who is losing everything usually makes noise. A person who is winning remains as quiet as a grave. Solene turned her back on Alistair. She walked into her study. The room smelled of beeswax, dried lavender, and the heavy, metallic scent of the platinum cuff on her wrist. She sat at her desk. It was a solid slab of ebony. She reached for her phone. Most people in her position would call the police. They would call their lawyers. They would call the local news to document the injustice. Solene Sterling was not most people. She knew the police were on Thorne's payroll. She knew her lawyers were already buried in a mountain of Thorne's frivolous motions. She dialed a number she knew by heart. A voice answered on the second ring. Low. Professional, yes. Ms. Sterling. Solene spoke. Her voice was a low velvet rasp. It carried the weight of a mountain. Julian, I need the setting changed on the Sterling Legacy Collection. All of them. The man on the other end paused. The entire collection. Solene, that would require a total liquidation of the current aesthetic. Solene looked out the window. She watched the lead bulldozer's bucket rise. It was positioned directly in front of the library's stained glass. Precisely. I want the emeralds removed. Replace them with the black diamonds we acquired in Luanda. And Julian. Yes. Prepare the valuation for a sovereign transfer. I am no longer interested in holding these assets under municipal jurisdiction. I am moving them to the vault on the Sterling Star. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The Sterling Star. That is a maritime vessel. Solene, if you move the assets there, they fall under Admiralty Law. I am aware. Solene hung up. She stood and walked back to the balcony. The bulldozer's bucket slammed into the stone. The library wall groaned. A crack like a lightning bolt raced up the masonry. Dust and ancient mortar exploded into the rain. Alistair Thorne was laughing now. He was checking his watch. He thought he was watching a woman lose her home. He didn't realize was watching a woman shed her skin by calling her jeweler. Solene had just triggered a specific clause in her family's private trust. A clause that had been dormant since 18-40-2. The moment the physical structure of the Sterling estate was breached by a commercial entity, the land ceased to be a residential property. According to the sovereign land patent buried in the library that Thorne was currently destroying, this ground was now classified as a free trade wharf. Under the Sterling Protocol, the moment the first stone fell, the entire property shifted into a different legal dimension. Solene looked at the panther cuff. She touched the platinum. Alistair Thorne thought he was building a port. He didn't know he was building it on land that had just become an independent nation, a nation where he was currently an illegal invader. Solene watched as the second bulldozer joined the first. The library wall collapsed in a roar of stone and wood. She did not blink. She picked up a small brass bell from the table beside her. She rang it once. Her butler, a man as silent as a shadow, peered in the doorway. Yes, madame. Tell the staff to move to the underground transport. We are leaving, and the house. Madame Solene looked at the ruins. A faint, cold smile touched her lips. Let him have the stones. He is going to need them to pay the docking fees. As Solene walked toward the private elevator, she felt the house shake. Another wall had fallen. She didn't care. The house was just a shell. The power was in the blood. The power was in the emerald-eyed panther that she wore like a shield. She reached the garage. A silver-armored SUV was waiting. As the vehicle sped away through the rear exit, Solene looked back one last time. Alistair Thorne was standing in the middle of her ruined garden. He was shouting into a cell phone. He looked small. He looked insignificant against the backdrop of the destruction he had caused. He thought he had one. He didn't know that by destroying the library, he had destroyed the only legal documents that protected him from what was coming next. Solene, Sterling leaned back into the leather seat. The real game was just beginning, and the first move was not a lawsuit. The first move was a total blackout of Thorne's global credit lines. She tapped the Panther Cuff. Check. The Grand Conservatory of the Obsidian Heights was a cage of glass and gold. It was the kind of room where the air itself cost more than a common man's annual salary outside. The city was a blurred watercolor of charcoal and neon. A relentless winter rain lashed against the reinforced panes. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of white lilies, expensive cigar smoke, and the metallic tang of old money. Solene Sterling stood near the center of the atrium. She was a pillar of mahogany and silver amidst a sea of pale, fickle socialites. Her floor-length gown was a liquid silk in the color of midnight. It clung to her frame with a disciplined grace. Every movement she made was calculated. Every breath was a measured exercise in restraint. The architectural silver-flecked afro-tapered cut of her hair caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. It made her look like a queen carved from the very earth Thorne was trying to steal. She lifted a flute of vintage champagne to her lips. She didn't drink. She merely sampled the aroma. Her right wrist was weighted by the Emerald-Eyed Platinum Panther Cuff. The platinum felt cold, constant, a silent reminder of the predator that lived beneath her skin. The emerald eyes of the panther glittered under the artificial lights. They seemed to watch the room, searching for the scent of a coward. The violins in the corner were playing something sharp, something discordant. It matched the tension in the room. The elite of the city were here. They were watching her. They had heard the rumors. They had seen the bulldozers at her gates. They were waiting for the moment she broke. Then the door swung open. Alistair Thorne entered the room like he owned the oxygen within it. He was dressed in a tuxedo that cost more than a luxury car. His silk pocket square was a jarring splash of crimson, the color of an open wound. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on Solene. A slow, arrogant smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who believed he had already won. He began to walk toward her. The crowd parted like water before a predator. Alistair didn't stop until he was inches from her space. He smelled of expensive bourbon and unearned confidence. He looked down at Solene's sharp cheekbones. He looked at the panther on her wrist. He laughed. "Oh, short, barking sound that lacked any real warmth, Solene. I must say, you have a remarkable talent for staying composed while your world is being paved over. Most people would be at home, packing their boxes, not standing in a ballroom pretending they still matter." Solene did not flinch. She did not lower her glass. She looked at him with the detached interest of an entomologist studying a particularly repulsive beetle. Her voice was a low, resonant velvet. "Alistair, you have always mistaken movement for progress. You think because you have broken my gates, you have broken my spirit. You are a third-generation heir. You have never built anything. You only know how to occupy." Alistair's smile tightened. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. It bore the official seal of the High Court. He didn't hand it to her. He dropped it onto the small marble table beside her. "That is a formal notice to vacate, Solene. By 10 a.m. tomorrow, my crews will be inside the main house. We are stripping the copper. We are tearing out the flooring. By noon, the Sterling estate will be a flat piece of dirt. The city has ratified the seizure. There is no appeal. There is no stay of execution. You are officially homeless." The room went silent. The only sound was the rain beating against the glass. The socialites leaned in. This was the moment they came for. The fall of the Sterling name. Solene looked down at the envelope. She didn't touch it. She looked back at Alistair. Her mahogany skin seemed to glow in the dim light. She ran her left hand over the Emerald-Eyed Panther Cuff. "Homeless. Is that the word you choose to use? Alistair, it is the legal reality. You have no primary residence. You have no registered address within this jurisdiction. You are a squatter in a house that belongs to Thorne Global Equities. Solene took a slow step forward. She was shorter than him, but in that moment, she seemed to tower over his entire legacy. You speak of legal realities, but you have always been blinded by your own greed. You assume I spent the last 48 hours crying over floorboards. I did not. I spent them reading. Specifically, I was reading the 1902 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Alistair frowned. His brow furrowed. What does maritime law have to do with a house in the suburbs? Everything, Alistair. Everything. She turned away from him and walked toward the massive glass wall overlooking the bay. She pointed a long, elegant finger toward the dark water. Do you see that light? 2 miles out, past the city limits. Alistair squinted through the rain. A single, cold white light was blinking in the distance. It belonged to a massive, sleek shadow of a vessel anchored in the deep water. The Sterling Star. That ship is a Dutch-flagged research vessel, Solene said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. It is registered as a sovereign floating domicile. As of 6 p.m. this evening, my legal primary residence has been moved to that ship. All my personal assets, my family records, and my physical presence are now under the jurisdiction of Admiralty Law. Alistair scoffed. So what? You're living on a boat? The house is still mine. Solene turned back to him. Her eyes were hard as diamonds. You don't understand, Alistair, because I have moved my primary residence to a sovereign vessel. The Sterling estate is no longer a residence. According to the city charter, a property without a resident for more than 12 hours during an eminent domain transition reverts to its original classification. She paused. The silence in the room was absolute, and the original classification of that land, according to the deed from 1842, is a maritime support zone. By beginning demolition on a maritime support zone without a federal port authority permit, you have committed a systemic violation of the Coastal Management Act. Alistair's face went pale. The silk pocket square seemed to drain of its color the moment your bulldozers broke the library wall. You didn't just destroy a house. You triggered a federal freeze on all Thorne Global Equities assets associated with that project. You are not just facing a lawsuit. You are facing an international maritime lien. Solene picked up the envelope Alistair had dropped. She didn't open it. She simply handed it back to him. You came here to evict me from a house I have already left, while I have spent the evening evicting you from the global banking system. She reached out and adjusted his crimson pocket square. Her fingers were steady. The notice to vacate, you should be worried about, Alistair, is the one the federal marshals are currently delivering to your boardroom. Alistair looked at the envelope in his hand like it was a live grenade. His phone began to vibrate in his pocket. Then again, and again. The sound was frantic. Solene adjusted her panther cuff. The emerald eyes seemed to flash with a final, deadly victory. I am not homeless, Alistair. I am sovereign. You, on the other hand, are about to find out how cold the world is when your bank accounts are under a federal seal. She turned her back on him. She did not look at the crowd. She walked toward the exit with the slow, heavy pace of a woman who had just ended a dynasty. Outside, the rain was still falling. But for the first time in a century, the Sterling name was not tied to the land. It was tied to the sea. And the sea was a much larger, much more dangerous place for a man like Alistair Thorne to drown. The heavy doors of the conservatory closed behind her with a sound like a gavel. Final, irreversible, absolute. The Sterling Star moved through the black water of the harbor like a silent blade cutting through silk. Inside the command deck, the only light came from the soft amber glow of ancient lamps and the flickering data streams on wall-to-ceiling monitors. The air smelled of ozone, expensive teak wood, and the faint, peppery scent of old parchment. Solene Sterling sat behind a desk of carved obsidian. She did not look like a woman who had just watched her family home be reduced to rubble. She looked like an architect who had finally seen the first beam of a grand design fall into place. Her mahogany skin was luminous against the dark leather of her chair. Her silver-flecked afro-tapered cut was a crown of iron and light. She was the picture of absolute, unshakable authority. On her right wrist, the emerald-dyed platinum panther cuff caught the amber light. The emeralds did not just sparkle. They seemed to breathe. They were a vivid, predatory green that matched the cold fire in Solene's own eyes. She ran her left thumb over the cool platinum surface. The weight of the metal was a grounding force. It was a physical manifestation of her patience. Before her lay a heavy, bronze-bound chest. It had been pulled from the deepest vault of the Sterling Library moments before the bulldozers struck. It was cold to the touch. It carried the damp chill of the earth it had been buried beneath for over a century. Solene reached for a small silver key she wore around her neck. Her fingers were steady. Her pulse was a slow, rhythmic drum. She was not rushing. A queen does not rush the execution of a traitor. The lock clicked with a heavy, mechanical thud as she lifted the lid. The scent of 1842 filled the room. It was the smell of dried ink, beeswax seals, and the heavy, fibrous weight of vellum that had survived wars, recessions, and the rise and fall of lesser families. She reached inside and pulled out a single, oversized document. It was wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the salt air. She unwrapped it slowly, gently, as if she were handling the beating heart of an empire. This was the hidden patent. It was not a standard property deed. It was not a contract signed by a local mayor or a bribed city official. It was a sovereign land patent, signed by the President of the United States and ratified by a specialized maritime commission that had long since been forgotten by the modern world. Solene laid the document flat on the obsidian desk. She traced the jagged lines of the ink with her fingertips. The paper was thick, toothsome. It felt like skin. Alistair Thorne believed in the power of the present. He believed in the power of his board of directors, his silk pocket squares, and his ability to buy the local zoning board. He viewed the law as a malleable thing, a tool for the highest bidder. He thought he had used the doctrine of eminent domain to seize the Sterling estate. He was wrong. The document beneath Solene's hand proved that the Sterling land had never been part of the incorporated city. In 1842, her ancestors had performed a specific sovereign service for the federal government. In exchange, they were granted a patent of absolute title. This was not a lease. This was not a grant of usage. It was a transfer of sovereignty, according to the language of the patent. The Sterling land was a federal enclave. It existed outside the jurisdiction of municipal taxes, outside the reach of city zoning, and most importantly, it was immune to the claims of eminent domain. The city didn't own the land. The state didn't own the land. Even the federal government had signed away its right to seize it without a declaration of total national emergency. Solene leaned back in her chair. She watched the rain streak across the bridge windows. Alistair Thorne was currently pouring $500 million of investor capital into a hole in the ground. He was pouring it into soil that he did not legally own. He was building on a foundation of by municipal standards. He was a developer by the standards of the hidden patent. He was an international TRSPASSER. Felt a cold, sharp satisfaction blooming in her chest. She picked up a magnifying glass with a platinum handle. She began to read the fine print of the original survey. The borders of the patent did not end at the shore. They extended 300 yards into the bay. They included the very seabed where Thorne was currently driving massive steel pylons for his deepwater port. Every move he made was a violation of international treaty. Every ton of concrete he poured was a gift to the Sterling Family Trust, because the patent held a allodial title. Any unauthorized structure built upon the land automatically reverted to the title holder. There was no litigation required. There was no long, drawn-out court battle. It was a self-executing legal trap. Solene looked at the monitors. She saw the satellite feed of the Thorne construction site. It looked like a hive of ants, moving dirt, building their own gallows. Alistair would be there now, probably drinking expensive scotch, congratulating himself on his ruthlessness. He thought he was the hunter. He thought Solene was the prey because she was quiet, because she didn't shout, because she was a woman of mahogany, skin and silver hair who stood alone on a balcony. He didn't understand the nature of quiet luxury. He didn't understand that true power doesn't need to bark. It waits, it plans. It secures the foundation before it ever reveals the sword. Solene adjusted the panther cuff. The emerald eyes seemed to wink at her in the dim light. She picked up her encrypted. She dialed the number for her lead counsel, a man who specialized in jurisdictional arbitrage and the deep, dark corners of maritime law. The line was silent for a moment. Then a voice whispered, "Yes. Madam Sterling." Solene looked at the signature on the 1842 patent. The ink was faded, but the power was still there. The hook is set. Julian Thorne has begun the foundation pour for the main terminal. He has committed 51% of his liquid assets to the site and the city. The lawyer asked, "The city is irrelevant. They have no standing on sovereign soil. We will allow him to continue for another 72 hours. I want the concrete to be dry. I want the structures to be permanent." Solene's voice was as cold as the Atlantic. "Once the primary structure is topped out, we will file the writ of quo warranto. We will demand he show by what authority he occupies sovereign ground." The lawyer chuckled. A dry, rasping sound. "He will have no answer. So, Lene, he will have his arrogance." She replied, "And that is exactly what will destroy him." She hung up the phone. She stood and walked to the window. The Sterling star swayed gently on the swell. In the distance, the lights of the city looked small, frail. Alistair Thorne believed he was a king. He believed he had the right to take whatever he wanted from a woman he deemed beneath him. He viewed Solene Sterling as a relic of a dying age. He was about to learn that some relics are loaded. He was about to learn the difference between a billionaire and a sovereign. Solene touched the glass of the window. The cold seeped into her fingertips. She thought about her grandfather, the man who had given her the chest and the key. He had told her to never use the patent unless the family's existence was threatened. He told her that once the seal was broken, there would be no going back. Thorne had made the mistake of making it personal. He hadn't just taken the land. He had mocked the blood. Solene turned back to the desk. She carefully rewrapped the patent in the oilcloth. She placed it back in the brass-bound chest and locked it. The trap was closed. The paper was in place. Alistair Thorne was currently a billionaire. In 72 hours, he would be an international debtor with no land, no port, and no way out. Solene Sterling walked to the small table in the corner of the bridge. She poured herself a cup of dark, bitter tea. She watched the rain. She watched the blinking white light of the buoy marking the edge of her sovereign territory. She was not a victim. She was not an exile. She was the owner of the very ground Thorne stood on, and she was about to charge him a price he couldn't afford to pay. The silence on the bridge was absolute. Heavy, loaded, deadly. The bridge of the Sterling Star was a sanctuary of cold precision. Outside, the Atlantic was a churning abyss of ink and foam. The rain lashed against the reinforced glass with the sound of 1,000 small, desperate fingers clawing for entry. Inside, the only sound was the low, constant hum of the ship's fusion generators and the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of a 19th century long case clock. Solene Sterling sat in the center of the gloom. The light from a dozen high-resolution monitors bathed her mahogany skin in a spectral, electric blue. She looked less like a woman and more like an ancient deity carved from obsidian and silver. Her architectural silver-flecked afro-tapered cut was a sharp, geometric masterpiece. It framed a face that had forgotten how to show fear. On her right wrist, the Emerald-Eyed Platinum Panther Cuff was the only thing that seemed to catch the light. The emeralds were 2 points of predatory green. They were steady, unblinking. Solene ran the tip of her index finger over the panther's platinum ears. The metal was frozen. It was the temperature of the deep ocean. It was the temperature of her resolve. She watched the screens. They were displaying a live thermal feed of the Sterling estate. 2 miles across the water. The land was a hive of frantic activity. Alistair Thorne was moving with the desperation of a man who believed that speed could outrun the truth. Massive yellow floodlights illuminated the construction site, making it look like a surgical incision in the dark of the coast. Solene watched as the concrete mixers arrived. A literal caravan of heavy machinery. They looked like a line of iron beetles marching toward a feast. Alistair was there. He was standing on the edge of the massive excavation pit. He was wearing a hard hat that looked absurd over his perfectly coiffed hair. He was gesturing wildly to a group of men in dark suits, even through the thermal lens. Solene could see the heat signature of his excitement. He was radiating energy, the frantic, unstable energy of a man who had finally touched the sun. Solene leaned forward. Her sharp cheekbones caught the blue light. Alistair Thorne had just authorized the transfer of $500 million. It was not his money. He didn't have $500 million in liquid assets. His wealth was a house of cards built on leveraged debt and fading family prestige. This money came from the Cayman Islands. It came from a network of ghost trusts and untraceable offshore accounts. It was the capital of men who did not like to lose. Men who expected their investments to be protected by the very institution Alistair is currently bypassing. Alistair believed he was being brilliant. He thought he was using untraceable capital to build his deepwater port on land he had stolen through a city loophole. He thought that once the concrete was poured, once the infrastructure was in the ground, the sheer weight of his investment would make it impossible for anyone to stop him. He called it the point of no return. Solene called it the gift of the sovereign. She watched as the first batch of concrete began to pour into the foundation. It was a thick, gray slurry. It looked like liquid lead. It flowed into the trenches, filling the voids, anchoring the steel pylons deep into the bedrock of her family's history. $500 million. Every gallon of that concrete was a donation to Solene Sterling. Every ton of steel was an involuntary contribution to her legacy. Alistair Thorne did not understand the principle of commingling of assets on sovereign soil. He believed that because he had a permit from a bribed city official, his construction was legal. He didn't realize that under the 1842 patent, the land he was standing on was a federal enclave. When you build on sovereign soil without the consent of the sovereign, you are not a developer. You are a benefactor, according to the law of accretion and improvement. Any permanent structure built upon sovereign ground without a signed lease agreement becomes the property of the title holder the moment the material touches the earth. Alistair was essentially building Solene $500 million port, and he was paying for it with the money of international cartels who would soon be looking for someone to blame. Solene's internal monologue was a cold, mathematical equation. She calculated the depth of the pour. She calculated the cure time of the concrete. She calculated the exact moment Thorne's liquidity would hit zero. He was over-leveraging everything. He had put up his grandfather's remaining estates as collateral for the bridge loans. He had tied his personal credit to the ghost trusts. He was all in. Solene touched the panther cuff. She felt the pulse in her wrist. It was slow. Even she thought about the day Alistair had handed her the notice to vacate. She remembered the way he had looked at her, as if she were a piece of furniture he was moving to the basement. He had no respect for the mahogany of her skin, no respect for the silver in her hair, no respect for the silence of her power. He thought her silence was a sign of weakness. He thought her lack of a legal team at the gates was a sign of surrender. He didn't know that Solene Sterling didn't fight with lawyers in municipal courts. She fought with the weight of centuries. She fought with the slow, grinding gears of international banking protocols. She looked at a secondary screen. It showed the ledger of the ghost, trust in the Caymans. She had already cracked the encryption 48 hours ago. She wasn't taking the money. Not yet. She was just watching it move. She was the shadow in the vault. She watched Alistair on the construction site. He was laughing now. He slapped the foreman on the back. He pulled a silver flask from his pocket and took a long, triumphant pull. He thought he had outsmarted a queen. Solene spoke. Her voice was a low, resonant velvet that filled the bridge. Build it. Alistair, build it high. Build it strong. She adjusted the collar of her midnight silk robe. The scent of aged dude and sea salt drifted from her skin. The more you build, the more you lose. The more you pour. The faster you drown. She imagined the moment the trap would close. It wouldn't be a violent confrontation. It wouldn't be a physical battle. It would be a phone call. A single, cold notification from the Federal Reserve. A freeze and seize. Order based on the violation of the sovereign land patent. Alistair would find himself standing on a pier he built. But he would be a trespasser. He would try to pay his men. But his accounts would be locked. He would try to call his offshore investors. But they would already be receiving a notice of fiduciary breach signed by Solene Sterling. She would not just take his port. She would take his reputation. She would leave him with a debt, while she kept the asset. This was the Sterling Protocol. It was not about revenge. It was about restoration of equity. Solene picked up a small, crystal glass of water. She didn't drink. She just held it, watching the way the vibration of the ship's engines created tiny, perfect ripples on the surface. Precision, that was the difference between a legacy and a name. Alistair Thorne was just a name. Solene Sterling was a legacy. The monitors flashed red. The foundation pour was 50% complete. Thorne was now officially into the second tranche of the offshore funds. He was now using money that carried life and death consequences. The weight of the trap was now heavy enough to crush him. Solene stood up. She walked to the window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The lights of the construction site looked like a distant, dying star. She raised her right hand. The Emerald-Eyed Platinum Panther Cuff glittered. It looked like it was ready to leap from her wrist and tear the throat. Out of the night? Check, she whispered. The sound was lost in the wind. But the reality was already written in the blood of the earth. Alistair. Thorne had 500 million reasons to be happy tonight. By tomorrow morning, he would have 500 million reasons to disappear. Solene turned her back on the window. She didn't need to watch anymore. The concrete was pouring. The trap was curing. The ocean was waiting. The sun did not rise over the Atlantic. It bled through the clouds. A weak, pale light that offered no warmth to the cold steel of the harbor. 2 miles from the coast, the Sterling Star sat motionless on the water, a black silhouette against a gray world. Inside the bridge, the air was a vacuum of silence, only broken by the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the mahogany chronometer on the wall. Solene Sterling stood at the center of the command deck. Her feet were planted. Her posture was a masterclass in architectural grace. She was dressed in a suit of midnight wool, so dark it seemed to absorb the dim light of the morning. Her mahogany skin possessed that signature matte finish, flawless, ancient. It was the skin of a woman who had seen empires crumble and knew that patience was the only true currency. Her architectural, silver-flecked afro-tapered cut was sculpted to perfection. It caught the flickering amber of the ship's navigation lights, reflecting a wisdom that Alistair Thorne could never buy. Solene was not looking at the shoreline with anger. She was looking at it with the detached, analytical gaze of a predator watching a trap spring shut on her right wrist. The Emerald-Eyed Platinum Panther Cuff was a constant, cold weight. She ran the fingers of her left hand over the panther's head. The platinum was smooth. The emerald eyes were a deep, dangerous green. They were the color of the deep sea, the color of the secrets buried beneath the waves. She looked through the high-powered binoculars on the distant shore. The first pier was complete. It was a massive, concrete arm reaching out into the bay, a $500 million monument to Alistair Thorne's arrogance. From this distance, it looked like a scar on the face of the earth. Solene could see the workers, tiny ant-like figures moving across the top of the structure. She could see the cranes, their long necks dipping and rising in a mechanical dance of destruction. And there, at the very tip of the pier, was Alistair Thorne. He was wearing a bespoke camel hair coat. A crimson silk pocket square flared from his chest like a drop of blood. He was holding a glass of champagne, raising it toward the horizon, toward the Sterling Star. He thought he was celebrating the completion of his foundation. He thought he had officially conquered the Sterling family's history. He didn't know that by finishing that pier. He had just signed his own death warrant. Solene lowered the binoculars. She turned back to the obsidian desk. A single, glowing tablet sat in the center of the dark stone. It was displaying a map of the harbor. But it wasn't a standard nautical chart. It was a jurisdictional overlay. The red line of the city limits stopped at the shoreline, the gold line of the Sterling sovereign. Patent extended 300 yards into the water, Alistair. Thorne had built his pier directly across that gold line. He had left the protection of the city. He had left the safety of municipal law. He had stepped into Solene's world. Solene picked up a silver stylus. Her hand was steady. Her breathing was a slow, controlled rhythm. She wasn't just filing a lawsuit. She was performing a maritime shift under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the specific ancient provisions of her family's sovereign patent. A permanent structure built from sovereign land into international or jurisdictional waters can be registered as an independent sovereign wharf. This was the checkmate by Leet, building a commercial pier on her sovereign seabed. Alistair had accidentally created an extraterritorial entity. He had built a port that, under international law, did not belong to the United States. It did not belong to the city. It belonged to the holder of the patent. Solene tapped the screen. The stylus made a soft, clipping sound against the glass, with a single, encrypted transmission. She sent the registration documents to the International Maritime Organization in London. She sent the jurisdictional claim to The Hague, and she sent a courtesy copy to the Federal Reserve. That the status of the property changed instantly. In the eyes of the global banking system, the Sterling estate and the newly built pier were no longer real estate. Were now a wharfage asset. Alistair Thorne's $500 million investment was no longer protected by the domestic courts he had bribed. It was now subject to port state control. It was subject to the Sterling Protocol. Solene leaned back in her chair. The leather creaked softly. She watched as the status bar on her screen turned from yellow to a deep, authoritative blue. The maritime shift was complete. She imagined Alistair on the pier, still sipping his champagne, still feeling the wind in his hair. He felt like a god. He thought he had taken her home. He didn't realize that the home he took was just a distraction. The real prize was the water. The real power was the ability to control the flow of global capital by registering the pier as a sovereign wharf. Solene now had the legal right to impound any vessel that touched its concrete. She had the right to levy international mooring fees. She had the right to seize any cargo that crossed its threshold for unpaid sovereign tolls. And most importantly, she had the right to call Alistair's $500 million abandoned maritime salvage. She touched the Panther Cuff. The emeralds seemed to glow brighter in the darkening bridge. She thought about the fiduciaries in the Cayman Islands, the men who had lent Alistair the money. They were not sentimental men. They were not loyal men. They were men of math when they realized their collateral was no longer located in a U.S.-governed city, but was now trapped in a sovereign enclave owned by Solene Sterling. They would not call their lawyers, they would call their collectors. Solene picked up the binoculars again. Alistair was walking back toward the shore. He looked small. His crimson pocket square was a tiny speck of color against the gray concrete. He was walking away from the pier, unaware that the ground beneath his feet had just shifted. He thought he was walking back to his car. He was actually walking into a financial, Hurricane Solene watched as a black SUV pulled up to the gates of the construction site. Two men in dark suits stepped out. They were not city officials. They were not builders, that they were the first wave of the audit. Solene felt the cold, sharp edges of the platinum cuff against her skin. It was a reminder that she was the predator. She was the one who decided when the game ended. She had waited decades for this moment. She had watched Thorne's family chip away at her legacy with their lawsuits and their greed. She had endured their whispers and their arrogance. Now, the tide had turned. The land was gone. But the ocean remained. And on the ocean, Solene Sterling was the only law that mattered. She stood up and walked to the bridge window. She pressed her hand against the glass. The vibration of the ship's engines traveled through her palm, a steady, powerful heartbeat. The first pier was finished. The first trap was sprung. The billion-dollar port was no longer Thorne's legacy. It was Solene's cage. She watched as the black SUV blocked Alistair's path. He stopped. He looked confused. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. Solene smiled. It was not a smile of joy. It was a smile of execution. She touched the emerald eyes of the panther. Welcome to my waters. Alistair. The cost of docking is everything you own, and the bill is now due. The bridge of the Sterling Star was a tomb of high-tech silence. Outside the Atlantic was a shifting landscape of mercury and shadow. The rain had turned into a fine, freezing mist that clung to the windows like a second skin. Inside, the air was pressurized, perfect. It carried the faint, aristocratic scent of sandalwood and the cold, sharp temps of liquid nitrogen from the server cooling systems. Solene Sterling sat motionless in her command chair. Her mahogany skin looked like polished wood under the dim, recessed lighting. Her face was a study in absolute, unyielding discipline. The sharp cheekbones and narrow nose gave her the appearance of a desert hawk waiting for the wind to shift. Her silver-flecked afro-tapered cut was an architectural triumph, reflecting a mind that lived 20 steps ahead of the current century. She rested her right arm on the obsidian-topped console. The emerald-dyed platinum panther cuff was the focal point of the room. The emeralds glowed with a sickly, beautiful green light. They were the eyes of a hunter that never slept. Solene ran her thumb over the cold, platinum flank of the panther. She felt the vibration of the ship's engines through the metal. It was a steady, predatory heartbeat. She was watching the horizon. 3 massive shadows were emerging from the fog. These were the Thorne Global Carriers. The Thorne Titan, the Thorne Legacy, and the Thorne Sovereign. Each one was a city of steel, carrying thousands of containers filled with electronics, industrial machinery, and high-value pharmaceuticals. They were the lifeblood of Alistair Thorne's empire. His quarterly projections and his personal pride were tied to the cargo. Inside those hulls, they were making their way toward the new port. The port Alistair had built on Solene's sovereign ground. Solen watched the radar blips on the primary screen. They were entering the 300-yard zone. The moment the bow of the Thorne Titan crossed that invisible gold line, the legal reality of the world changed. She did not smile. She simply adjusted the panther cuff. Alistair Thorne was currently in his penthouse office. He was likely staring at a glass of 20-year-old scotch, admiring his new silk pocket square. He believed the port was open for business. He believed he had won the war of attrition. He thought that because the concrete was dry and the cranes were moving, the victory was his. He was about to learn that ownership is not a matter of possession. It is a matter of jurisdiction. Solene picked up a sleek AIT. If we are at a sleek titanium headset. Her voice was a low, resonant velvet when she opened the channel to the Thorne Titan's bridge. This is the Sterling Sovereign Wharfage Authority. You are entering a private, independent sovereign enclave under the 1842 Patent and International Maritime Law. You are hereby required to declare your manifest and accept the sovereign mooring schedule. There was a long silence on the other. And then The confused voice of the captain came through. "Sterling, authority. We have clearance from the City Port Authority. We are docking at the Thorne Global Terminal. We are not aware of any sovereign wharfage." Solene's expression remained frozen. "Like a winter lake. The City Port Authority has no jurisdiction beyond the mean high tide line of 1842. You are currently trespassing on sovereign ground. If you proceed to the pier, you are voluntarily entering into an administrative admiralty contract." The captain hesitated, but he had his orders from Thorne himself. He had been told to ignore any fringe claims from the former landowner. He pushed the engines forward. The Thorne Titan moved toward the concrete pier. The moment the first mooring line was thrown, the trap snapped shut on Solene's screen. A series of automated invoices began to generate. This was the toll of arrogance. Under the Sterling Protocol, the mooring fees for a sovereign wharf were not based on weight or volume. They were based on a percentage of the total gross value of the vessel's parent company. It was a litigation protection fee designed to bankrupt anyone who attempted to use the property without a signed treaty. The Thorne Titan was carrying $200 million in cargo. The sovereign mooring fee for the first hour was $250 million by the time the Thorne Legacy and the Thorne Sovereign docked. Alistair Thorne was being billed $750 million per hour. It was a mathematical impossibility. It was a financial execution disguised as a docking permit. Solene watched as the data began to stream into Thorne's corporate headquarters. She could imagine the alarms going off. She could imagine the confusion in the accounting department. They would try to call the city. The city would tell them they had no power over the sovereign enclave. They would try to call the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard would see a valid international maritime registration for a sovereign port and would refuse to interfere in a commercial fee dispute. Alistair Thorne was now trapped. If he tried to move the ships, he would be in violation of a maritime lien. If he left them there, the fees would exceed the total net worth of his company within 6 hours. Solene leaned back. She watched the green eyes of the panther Cuff sparkle in the dark. She thought about the concept of fiduciary duty. Alistair had a duty to protect his investors' money. But by building on sovereign land, he had placed that money into a legal vacuum. He had committed a gross negligence that bypassed all corporate indemnity clauses. He was personally liable. His phone would be ringing now, not with congratulations, but with the sounds of terrified board members and furious offshore investors. The men from the Cayman Islands would be looking at their screens. Seeing their untraceable capital being swallowed by a sovereign entity they couldn't sue. Solene reached for a small, hand-carved ebony box on her desk. She pulled out a single black diamond. She held it up to the light. It was the color of the void. She thought about the library Alistair had destroyed, the ancient books, the family records, the physical history of her people. He thought he had turned them into dust. He didn't realize that dust is the foundation of the earth, and the earth belongs to those who know how to read the deep contracts. She looked at the internal monologue of her own strategy. This was not about the money. She didn't need Thorne's millions. She was destroying the mechanism he used to hurt people. She was dismantling the institutional power that allowed him to believe he was a god. The pulse in her wrist was steady, a slow, deep rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock. She was the invisible architect. She had allowed him to build the pier because a pier is a fixed asset. You cannot hide a pier in a shell company. You cannot move a pier to a Swiss bank account. It is a physical monument to a legal error. Alistair had built his own cage on the monitor. A video feed from the pier showed Alistair Thorne arriving in a frantic, speeding motorcade. He stepped out of his car. His hair was disheveled. His silk pocket square was hanging limp from his pocket. He was screaming at the port workers. He was pointing at the Sterling star sitting out in the bay. He looked small. He looked like a child throwing a tantrum against the tide. Solene picked up the titanium headset one last time. She didn't call Alistair. She called the Thorne Global CFO. Man who understood the language of bankruptcy better than his boss. Mr. Henderson, Solene said. Her voice was like cold silk dot. Who is this? The man asked. His voice was shaking. This is Solene Sterling. I am the harbor master of the Sterling Sovereign Wharf. You are currently in default of your mooring fees. As of 3 minutes ago, I have filed a writ of foreign attachment in international court. The CFO was silent. He knew what that meant. It meant every Thorne Global account in every country was now subject to a freeze and seize. Ordered to satisfy the sovereign debt. You can't do this. He whispered, Dodd, I have already done it. Solene replied, Your CEO provided the foundation. Your investors provided the capital. And the 1842 patent provided the jurisdiction. She paused, letting the weight of the reality sink in. Tell Alistair to keep his champagne. He's going to need it. It's the only liquid asset he has left. She cut the line. Solene Sterling stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the 3 massive ships. They were no longer symbols of Thorne's power. They were her collateral. They were the physical evidence of his arrogance. She touched the Panther Cuff. The platinum was warm now, warmed by her skin. The emerald eyes seemed to glow with a final, absolute satisfaction. The toll had been collected, the empire was leaning, and the fall would be silent, heavy and absolute. The bridge of the Sterling Star was a cathedral of shadow and light. Outside, the Atlantic harbor was a churning cauldron of leaden water and white foam. The rain had intensified, becoming a relentless vertical assault that blurred the distinction between sea and sky. Inside, the air was chilled to exactly 64 degrees. It was a temperature that demanded alertness. It carried the scent of cold ozone, polished obsidian, and the faint, earthy aroma of the dark tea Solene was sipping. Solene Sterling sat in the high-backed command chair. She was a vision of mahogany and silver. Her skin, dark as a moonless night and finished with a perfect matte texture, looked like it had been sculpted from the very foundation of the earth. Her sharp, aristocratic cheekbones were highlighted by the blue glow of the massive data arrays surrounding her. Her architectural silver-flecked afro-tapered cut was an unwavering crown of intent. She did not look like a woman in the middle of a war. She looked like a woman who had already rewritten the terms of peace. On her right wrist, the emerald-dyed platinum panther cuff was the only thing that appeared to live in the bridge's gloom. The emerald eyes of the panther glittered with a predatory, cold intelligence. They were a vivid, toxic green. Solene ran the tips of her fingers over the sleek platinum ears of the beast. The metal was frozen. It felt like the heart of a glacier. She took a slow breath. Her pulse was a steady, measured 60 beats per minute. She was watching the digital collapse of an empire on the primary monitor. A live feed of Alistair Thorne's penthouse office was being transmitted through an encrypted satellite link. The man was a ghost of his former self. His bespoke navy suit was rumpled. His crimson silk pocket square was frayed, hanging limp like a flag of surrender. He was pacing the length of his mahogany-paneled office. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold his phone. He was screaming into the receiver. But the voice on the other end was a wall of cold. Corporate bureaucracy. I don't care about the regulations. Thorne barked. I need that trust liquidated now. Move the 50 million. I have mooring fees to pay. If those ships stay at that pier for another hour, Thorne Global is finished. Solene watched him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying star. She knew what he was trying to do. He was attempting to tap into the Thorne family legacy trust. It was a Tesiot reservoir of wealth protected by ironclad tiers of legal shielding. It was his last line of defense, his final reservoir of liquidity. He believed that if he could just move that money, he could pay the sovereign tolls, move his ships, and live to fight another legal battle. He was wrong. Alistair Thorne did not understand the nature of the debt he carried. He thought his bank, the Atlantic Merchant Bank, was his partner. He believed that because his grandfather had helped found the institution, he was immune to its mechanics. Solene adjusted her panther cuff. The emerald eyes seemed to flash in sync with a red notification on her screen. She had been planning this move since the day Thorne first breached her gates. She hadn't just watched him build his port. She had watched his credit profile. She had observed the way he had leveraged his bank's internal debt service obligations to fund his offshore ventures. In the world of high-velocity finance, banks often package their internal debts into secondary market instruments. It is a way for them to move risk off their books. Most people don't buy these instruments. They are complex, dangerous, and require a profound understanding of global banking protocols. Solene Sterling understood them perfectly. Over the last 72 hours, while Alistair was busy pouring concrete, Solene had been quietly executing a hostile debt acquisition through a series of shadow entities. Registered on the Sterling Star, she had purchased 51% of Atlantic Merchant Bank's secondary debt service obligations. She didn't own the bank. She owned the bank's right to collect. On the monitor, Alistair slammed the phone down. He turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keys as he attempted to force an override on the trust's liquidity lock. The screen in front of him flashed a deep, brutal red dot. Access denied. Asset subject to credit default lien. Alistair froze. He stared at the words as if they were written in a language he had forgotten. He hit the keys again, harder this time. The sound echoed through the silent office. Access denied. Solene picked up her own tablet. Her fingers moved with a grace that made the action look like a ritual. She opened the direct channel to Alistair's personal terminal. "Alistair," she said. Her voice was a low, resonant velvet that seemed to vibrate through the very air of his office. Alistair Thorne spun around, looking for the source of the voice. He saw his computer screen flicker. Solene's face appeared, a mahogany mask of absolute, unwavering power. Her silver-flecked hair looked like a halo of cold metal. Solene. Thorne gasped. His voice was thin, brittle. "What have you done? Why can't I move my money?" Solene looked at him. Her eyes were as cold as the emeralds on her wrist. "You are attempting to liquidate a trust that is no longer yours to command. Alistair, you leveraged your bank's debt to build your port. You believed the bank was your shield. You didn't realize the shield was for sale." Thorne stepped toward the screen. Sweat was beaded on his forehead, ruining the matte finish of his skin. "I have a line of credit. I have equity." "You had equity," Solene corrected him. "I have purchased 51% of your bank's debt service obligations under the fiduciary duty protocols of the secondary market. I have the right to freeze any outgoing transfers that threaten the bank's liquidity." She paused, letting the weight of the realization crush him. "By docking your ships at my sovereign wharf, you incurred a debt that exceeds your bank's total cash reserves. If the bank allows you to liquidate that trust, they would be in violation of their capital requirements." She raised her right hand. The Emerald-Eyed Platinum Panther Cuff caught the light. The panther seemed to be leaping toward the camera as the majority debt holder. "I have exercised my right of strategic foreclosure. Your trust is now a frozen asset. It is the collateral for the sovereign tolls you owe me." Alistair's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of his mahogany desk to keep from falling. His crimson pocket square finally fell to the floor. "Lost in the shadows. This is illegal," he whispered. "You can't just buy a bank's debt and freeze a private trust. It is not just legal, Alistair. It is institutional. You live by the loophole. Now you will drown in the protocol." Solene leaned back in her chair. The sound of the leather was like a final, heavy door closing. "You have $500 million in concrete sitting on my land. You have 3 ships full of cargo you cannot unload. And now you have a bank account you cannot touch." She looked at her panther cuff, touching the emerald eyes one last time before cutting the feed. "You thought you were a king, Alistair. But you forgot that a king without gold is just a man in an expensive suit." The screen went black. Solene Sterling sat in the silence of the bridge. The ticking of the mahogany clock was the only sound. It was the sound of a legacy being restored. 1 second at a time, she felt the heavy weight of the platinum on her wrist. It was a comfort, to shield, a reminder that her patience had been rewarded. She had not just taken his money, she had taken his ability to move. She had frozen him in his own arrogance. She looked out at the storm. The rain was finally starting to let up. The first light of a new, sovereign morning was beginning to touch the edges of the horizon. The liquidity freeze was complete. The Thorne name was now a liability. And Solene Sterling was just getting started. She reached for her tea. It was still warm. The taste was bitter, dark, and absolutely perfect. The air at the Elson Global Gateway was thick with the scent of salt water, expensive cologne, and the ozone-heavy weight of an approaching storm. The grand opening was a spectacle of calculated arrogance. A sprawling pavilion of glass and white steel had been erected on the very spot where the Sterling Library once stood. Under the glare of 1,000 high-intensity floodlights, the concrete of the new pier looked like bone, bleached, cold, and utterly lifeless. Alistair Thorne stood at the center of the podium. He was the image of third-generation triumph. His tuxedo was a midnight navy. His silk pocket square was a sharp, defiant violet. He held a golden microphone in one hand and a glass of vintage crystal in the other. He looked out at the sea of faces. The city's elite, the governors, the bankers, the men who had watched him bulldoze a legacy and decided to clap for the destruction. He was smiling, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were darting toward the edges of the crowd, searching for the auditors he knew were circling his accounts. He was a man standing on a crack in the ice, trying to convince the world he was walking on granite. Today, we don't just open a port. Alistair's voice boomed through the speakers, vibrating against the hulls of the 3 massive Thorne carriers docked at the pier. Today, we announce that the old world is dead. The era of sentimental landholding is over. Thorne Global Equities has built a bridge to the future. And that bridge begins right here. On this soil. The crowd erupted in polite, disciplined applause. Alistair raised his glass toward the dark Atlantic. He didn't see the shadow moving across the water. So, Solene Sterling sat in the rear of a matte black tender. The small vessel cut through the harbor chop with the silent precision of a ghost. She was not dressed for a gala. She was dressed for an execution. Her mahogany skin was a deep, rich contrast against the ivory silk of her high-collared coat. Her face was a masterclass in stillness. The razor-sharp cheekbones, the narrow, aristocratic nose. She looked like a monument that had decided to walk. Her flecked afro-tapered cut was a crown of architectural power. It caught the sweeping beams of the port's lighthouse, reflecting the iron will of a woman who had waded through the rain to claim the sun. On her right wrist, the Emerald-Eyed Platinum Panther Cuff was visible. It was not just an accessory. It was a weapon of visual consistency. The emerald eyes were twin points of toxic green. They watched the approaching pier with a hunger that was centuries old. Solene ran her hand over the platinum flank of the beast. She could feel the vibration of the port's heavy machinery. Alistair Thorne thought he was celebrating his birthright. He was actually celebrating his funeral. The tender pulled alongside the private dock at the base of the pavilion. Solene stepped out. Her heels did not click. They struck the concrete with the heavy, rhythmic weight of a closing ledger. She didn't use the stairs. She used the ramp designated for official port personnel. She walked toward the podium. The crowd began to part, not because they knew who she was, but because her presence demanded a vacuum. She was the only person in the room who wasn't pretending. She was the only person who actually owned the ground beneath their feet. Alistair Thorne saw her. His voice faltered. The gold microphone made a sharp, electronic screech. Solene, he hissed into the mic. Before realizing the whole world was listening, he quickly adjusted his silk pocket square. Regaining a shred of his mask, Solene Sterling, I didn't realize you were on the guest list. But then again, I suppose it's only fair you see what a real developer can do with your dusty little backyard." He laughed. It was a thin, desperate sound. The crowd joined in. A ripple of nervous, shallow amusement. Solene did not stop until she reached the base of the podium. She looked up at him. Her eyes were not filled with anger. They were filled with the cold, detached boredom of a judge reading a guilty verdict. "Alistair," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried to the back of the pavilion. It was a low, resonant velvet that seemed to silence the wind. "You have spent $500 million building a house of cards. You have invited the world to watch you crown yourself king." She stepped up the first. But you made a fundamental error in your due diligence. You assumed that a municipal permit was a grant of sovereignty. You assumed that because you could destroy a building, you could destroy the law that governed the dirt beneath it. Alistair's face turned a mottled, angry red. "I have the city charter. I have the eminent domain order. Get her off my stage." He signaled to the private security guards. 4 men in black suits moved forward. They were large, professional, and utterly irrelevant. Solene did not look at them. She reached into the pocket of her ivory coat and pulled out a heavy, black leather folder. It bore the gold leaf seal of the International Maritime Organization and the silver star of the Sterling. "Sauver patent. Stay where you are," Solene said to the guards. Her voice was an iron bar. One of the guards hesitated. He looked at the folder. He looked at the emerald-eyed panther on her wrist. He saw the authority in her mahogany skin. He stopped. Solene turned back to Alistair. "Under the 1842 sovereign land patent, this territory is an independent sovereign wharf. As of 6 o'clock this morning, the Admiralty Court in London has ratified the appointment of the sovereign harbor master for this enclave." She opened the folder and held it up. "Not for Alistair, but for the cameras of the global press. I am the harbor master, Solene Sterling, and I am here to perform a mandatory safety and jurisdictional inspection of every vessel currently moored at my pier." Alistair let out a frantic, wet laugh. "Harbor master, you're insane. This is a private corporate terminal. You have no standing here." Solene stepped onto the podium. She was now inches from him. The scent of her aged dude and sea salt overwhelmed the smell of his expensive Scotch. "Standing, Alistair, is a matter of record, not opinion." She turned to the crowd, her voice rising with the weight of institutional power. "The Thorne Titan, the Thorne Legacy, and the Thorne Sovereign are currently in violation of the Sovereign Mooring Act. They have failed to pay the jurisdictional tolls. They have failed to provide a valid manifest to the sovereign harbor master." She pointed a long, elegant finger toward the 3 massive ships. "Under the power of the maritime writ of sequestration, I am hereby impounding these vessels. They are now the property of the Sterling Sovereign Trust until all outstanding debts are satisfied." The silence that followed was absolute. "Alistair." Thorne's glass of crystal slipped from his hand. It shattered on the stage, the liquid soaking into his navy trousers. "You can't impound my ships," he whispered, his voice cracking. "That's $1 billion in cargo. You'll be sued into the Stone Age." Solene leaned in. Her sharp cheekbones were inches from his. "Who will sue me?" "Alistair, the bank that I now hold the debt for, or the offshore investors who are currently receiving a notice that you have lost their collateral on sovereign soil." She reached out. Her fingers brushed the silk of his violet pocket square. She didn't pull it. She just touched it with the tip of her index finger. The panther on her wrist seemed to snarl in the electric light. "You thought the fall would be loud, Alistair. You thought there would be a fight. But the elite don't fight. We execute." She looked at the security guards, cleared the pavilion. "This port is now under a sovereign lockdown. Any unauthorized personnel remaining on the pier in 5 minutes will be arrested for international trespassing." The guests didn't wait. They were men and women of business. They saw the shift in the wind. They saw the mahogany queen standing over the fallen heir. They began to move toward the exits. Not in a panic, but in a rush of self-preservation. They were leaving Alistair Thorne behind. Solene turned her back on him. She walked to the edge of the stage and looked out at her ships. They were no longer Thorne's carriers. They were her restitution. She felt the cold, platinum weight of the Panther Cuff. It was the only thing in the world that felt real. Alistair was still standing at the podium, alone. The gold microphone was still on, picking up the sound of his ragged, terrified breathing. He had built a gateway, but Solene Sterling had just changed the locks, and the price of entry was his entire life. The wind howled through the empty ribs of the grand pavilion, a hollow, mournful sound that felt like the breath of a dying empire. The glass walls, once a symbol of Alistair Thorne's transparency and power, now felt like a transparent cage. Outside the harbor was a churn of white-capped waves. Inside, the silence was heavy enough to crush the lungs. Solene Sterling stood at the edge of the stage. Her ivory coat caught the flickering light of the dying floodlights, making her look like a beacon of cold, unyielding judgment. Her mahogany skin was dark, lustrous, and absolutely still. Not a single muscle in her face moved. She was the embodiment of a predator that had already won the hunt and was now simply deciding how to dispose of the remains. Her architectural silver-flecked coat was sharp, precise. It framed a face that was etched with a century of collective family patience. On her right wrist, the Emerald-Eyed Platinum Panther Cuff seemed to watch Alistair with a life of its own. The emeralds were a toxic, vibrant green. They were the color of the deep, dark water where things go to be forgotten. Solene ran her thumb over the panther's platinum spine. The metal was frozen, a conductor for the absolute chill that radiated from her spirit. Alistair Thorne was collapsed on the stairs of the podium. His tuxedo was ruined by rain and champagne. His violet silk pocket square was a sodden, limp rag. He looked at the floorboards, the very boards he had ordered to be laid over the ruins of Solene's library. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a man who had finally realized he was a ghost. "Solene," he whispered. His voice was a dry rattle. "$1 billion in cargo is sitting on those ships. My investors will kill me before the courts do. Just let the ships leave. Take the land. Take the concrete. Just let the ships go." Solene took a slow step toward him. Her heels made a heavy, singular strike against the wood. "The ships are not yours to command, Alistair. They haven't been yours since the moment your first lines touched the bollards of this wharf." She looked out at the massive steel hulls of the Thorne Titan and the Thorne Legacy. They were silent, impounded. Their crews were sequestered. Their engines were cold. "You speak of cargo," Solene continued, her voice a low, resonant velvet. "You speak as if this is a simple matter of a parking ticket. You still do not understand the depth of the noose you have tied around your own neck." Alistair looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. "What noose? It's a fee dispute. My lawyers will tie this up for 20 years. Solene looked at him with something that wasn't quite pity. It was too cold for pity. "Your lawyers are currently being served with a disqualification of counsel," she said, "because Thorne Global Equities is no longer an independent legal entity. It is an asset in salvage." Alistair's jaw dropped. His hands, clutched against his knees, began to shake. "Salvage? You're talking about a ship." "I'm a corporation. In the eyes of international maritime law," Solene said. "You are a negligent actor who has abandoned high-value assets on sovereign soil." She pulled a second document from her black leather folder. This one was older. The paper was yellowed, thick. It bore a wax seal that was the color of dried blood. "When you built this port, Alistair, you did not just build a pier. You created what is known in Admiralty Law as a permanent marine improvement. Under the 1842 sovereign patent, any improvement made to this sovereign enclave without a valid treaty of usage falls under the doctrine of involuntary bailment." Solene leaned down, bringing her mahogany face inches from his. The scent of her aged oud and sea salt was the smell of the earth, self, because you commingled your entire corporate structure with this project, because you used your corporate credit to fund a trespass. You have essentially driven your entire company into my harbor. And Alistair, the ship is sinking. She stood back up. The Panther Cuff glittered. Under the principle of pure salvage. A party who saves an imperiled asset on sovereign water is entitled to a reward. Normally, that reward is a percentage of the value. She paused. A long 3-second silence filled the room. But because you were the one who created the peril, because you knowingly committed an act of jurisdictional sabotage, the salvage reward is not a percentage. It is the whole. Alistair scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over his own tuxedo. You can't salvage a company. That's not a thing. It is a thing when that company has legally tied its existence to a maritime asset. Solene's voice was like a gavel striking stone. Your board of directors, in their infinite greed, voted to reincorporate Thorne Global Equities as a port operating firm specifically for this location. They did this to avoid city taxes. They did it to bypass state labor laws. She laughed. A short, sharp sound that had no humor in it by doing so. They legally redefined your entire corporation as a maritime vessel. A vessel that is currently grounded, abandoned, and trespassing on my sovereign land. She tapped the document in her hand. I have filed a claim of salvage rights over Thorne Global Equities. As of 4 p.m. this afternoon, I am not just your landlord. I am the receiver. I own your patents. I own your contracts. I own the very desk you sit at in that penthouse. Alistair's breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked around the empty pavilion, as if searching for an escape. But there were no doors left to open. Every dollar you poured into this concrete was a link in the chain, Solene said. She walked to the edge of the stage, looking out at the rain. You thought you were taking my past, but you were actually handing me your future. She thought about her ancestors, the ones who had fought for the 1842 patent. They had known that one day, a man like Thorne would come, a man who believed that the law was a suggestion. They had built a trap that took nearly 200 years to snap. Solene felt the cold, heavy weight of the platinum on her wrist. It was a connection to them, a physical link to a lineage that did not break. This was not revenge. This was the natural order of things. The arrogant elite always forget that the foundations of the world are deeper than their ledgers. They forget that the blood of the earth has a memory. Solene turned back to Alistair. I have already sent the notice to your offshore investors. I have informed them that their capital has been classified as abandoned property in a salvage zone. I have offered them 10 cents on the dollar to walk away. She smiled. A slow, deadly curve of her lips. They took it, Alistair. They took it in 3 minutes. They would rather lose 90% of their money than spend one day in an Admiralty court against the Sterling Sovereign Trust. Alistair Thorne slumped back down. He looked like a puppet with its strings cut. His navy tuxedo looked black in the dim light, the color of a bruise. So, what now? He whispered now. Solene said, her voice rising with the finality of a closing tomb. You walk out of here. You don't take your car. It belongs to the salvage claim. You don't go to your office. The locks have been changed. She pointed toward the gate. The gate he had bulldozed. You walk, Alistair, and you hope that I don't decide to sue you for the cost of the demolition you performed on my property? Alistair looked at her. He saw the mahogany skin, the silver-flecked hair, the emerald eyes of the panther. He saw a queen who had dismantled him without ever raising her voice. He didn't say a word. He stood up, moving with the stiff, robotic gait of a man in shock. He walked toward the rain. Solene watched him go. She didn't feel joy. She felt a profound, deep sense of completion. The Sterling estate was gone. The library was dust. But the sovereignty remained. She reached out and touched the Panther Cuff. The emeralds seemed to glow. One last time before the floodlights finally flickered and the noose was tight. The salvage was complete. And for the first time in a century, the Sterling name was the only one that mattered on this coast. She turned toward her tender, waiting in the black water. The ocean was quiet. The debt was paid, and the night was hers. The fog rolled in from the Atlantic like a thick, cold shroud. It was not a mist. It was a physical weight. It carried the scent of wet iron, ancient salt, and the bitter, metallic tang of the harbor's industrial heart. The world had shrunk to a radius of 20 feet. Within that circle, the only reality was the gray concrete of the pier and the dark, churning water of the bay. Solene Sterling stood at the very edge of the independent, sovereign wharf. She was a silhouette of absolute, unyielding power against the white void. Her ivory coat was draped over her shoulders like a ceremonial robe. The fabric was a heavy, imperial silk that refused to flutter in the wind. Her mahogany skin possessed a perfect matte finish, looking like it had been forged in the deep pressure of the Earth's core. Her silver-flecked afro-tapered cut was a crown of architectural precision. Each silver strand caught the dim, diffused light of the fog, signaling a mind that had outcalculated the elite for 3 generations. Solene was not breathing hard. Her pulse was a slow, rhythmic echo of the ocean's tide on her right wrist. The Emerald-Eyed Platinum Panther Cuff was the only point of color in the gray world. The emerald eyes were a deep, predatory green. They seemed to glow with an internal, radioactive intensity. Solene ran her thumb over the panther's platinum spine. The metal was frozen. It felt like the heart of the law itself, cold, heavy, and final. Alistair Thorne was 10 feet away. He was standing in the center of the pier he had built with stolen capital. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His navy tuxedo was soaked through, clinging to his frame like a second, failing skin. His crimson silk pocket square was a dark, saturated lump in his pocket, a symbol of a legacy that had just been liquidated. He looked back toward the shoreline. He looked toward the city he thought he owned, through the fog. The faint, blue and red lights of federal vehicles were visible at the edge of the property. The marshals were waiting. They were not there for Solene. They were there for the CEO of Thorne Global Equities. They were there to serve the warrants for the fiduciary breach, the tax evasion, and the fraudulent use of offshore ghost trusts. Solene adjusted the panther cuff. The sound of the platinum clicking against her skin was the only noise in the absolute silence. Alistair turned back to her. His face was a mask of terror and disbelief. "Solene," he whispered. The sound was thin, lost in the heavy air. "I can't go back there. If I step off this pier, they'll arrest me. The city, the feds, everyone." Solene looked at him. Her sharp cheekbones were like blades under her mahogany skin. Her voice was a low, resonant velvet that carried the weight of a closing vault. "That is the nature of a sovereign enclave, Alistair. On this pier, you are under my jurisdiction. You are currently standing on ground that is not part of the United States. You are a guest of the Sterling Sovereign Trust." She took a slow, deliberate step toward the edge where her tender was waiting. "But my hospitality has reached its limit. I have filed the final notice of trespass. You are now an unauthorized entity on sovereign soil." Alistair scrambled forward, his expensive shoes slipping on the wet concrete. "But if I stay here, I'm trespassing. And if I leave, I'm a fugitive. I have nowhere to go." Solene did not stop. She did not look back. "You should have thought about the geography of your crimes, Alistair. You've spent $500 million building a bridge to nowhere. You built a pier that is a legal island. You are standing in a jurisdictional vacuum of your own making." She reached the boarding ramp of her private tender. The small, sleek vessel hummed with the power of twin turbines, a sound like a tiger purring in the dark. Alistair's voice rose to a frantic scream. "You can't leave me here, Solene. It's a dead zone. I have no phone, No money. No way to get off this rock. Solene turned at the top of the ramp. She stood framed by the white fog. The emerald-eyed panther on her wrist caught the light of the ship's deck. The green eyes seemed to snarl at the broken man on the pier. Not leaving you, Alistair. I am merely reclaiming my silence. She looked at the silver-flecked strands in her hair, thinking of her father and his father. Before him, they had been told they didn't belong on this land. They had been told their names were footnotes. Today, the footnotes had become the law. Quiet luxury, Solene thought, is not about the price of the coat. It is about the power to walk away while your enemy is frozen in a cage he built for himself. She signaled to the pilot. The tender began to pull away from the pier. The gap of black, frigid water widened between Solene and Alistair Thorne. Alistair ran to the edge. He stopped just as his toes reached the line of the Sovereign Wharf. He looked at the water. Then he looked back at the marshals waiting in the distance. He was trapped in a 300-yard strip of concrete, a king of a kingdom that consisted of nothing but wet stones and broken promises. The fog began to swallow him. First, his shoes disappeared. Then the navy blue of his ruined tuxedo. Finally, the last thing Solene saw was the pale, terrified white of his face, before he was completely erased by the Atlantic mist. The silence was now absolute. Solene walked into the cabin of the tender. The air inside smelled of white lilies and expensive vellum. The temperature was a perfect 72 degrees. She sat on the leather bench, looked at her right wrist. The Platinum Panther was still there. Its work was done. The emerald eyes were calm now, reflecting the deep, dark peace of the ocean. She touched the matte skin of her cheek. She felt the warmth of her own blood, a bloodline that had survived the bulldozers, the lawsuits, and the arrogance of the elite. The Sterling Star was waiting for her in the deep water as the tender docked with the mother ship. Solene felt the heavy, rhythmic throb of the massive engines. They were moving. They were leaving the jurisdiction of the small-minded. They were sailing toward the horizons that only the sovereign can see. Solene Sterling picked up a glass of dark tea. She did not look back at the shore. She did not look at the ruin of the port. She had restored the equilibrium. She had executed the Sterling Protocol. The elite think that power is a loud thing. They think it is made of steel and concrete and shouting. They are wrong. Power is the ability to wait. Power is the knowledge of the hidden patent. Power is the absolute silence of a queen who has already moved the world while her enemies were still sleeping. The fog closed in behind the Sterling Star, hiding the ship, hiding the sovereign, hiding the truth. On the pier, Alistair Thorne was still standing. A man without a country. A man without a bank. A man who had finally learned that you should never try to steal the earth from the people who know how to talk to the sea. Solene took a sip of her tea. The taste was bitter, clean, and final. The debt was settled. The legacy was anchored. And the night, like the ocean, belonged entirely to her. The Sterling Star vanished into the white dot. Absolute. Sovereign. Gone.